I thought I was just stopping at the store for milk, but I was about to walk into a setup designed to end my career and my life. When two officers tried to frame me for a serious crime, they didn't realize they had just cornered the one person with the power to dismantle their entire shadow network. The fluorescent lights of the megamart flickered overhead, casting a sterile, sickly glow over the aisles that felt more like a cage than a retail space. I was tired, not just the physical exhaustion of a double shift, but the bone-deep weariness that comes from 20 years of navigating a world that often looked at my badge before it looked at my face. I had stopped in to grab a carton of milk and a few necessities, my off-duty clothes, a simple hoodie and jeans, doing a better job of camouflaging me than I'd intended. I was just another face in the crowd, a shadow in a store that prided itself on surveillance. I reached for a bottle of shampoo on the top shelf, my mind wandering toward the cold case files sitting on my desk at the precinct. I didn't notice the two uniformed officers hovering near the end of the aisle until they were practically breathing down my neck. They weren't looking for a thief. They were looking for a target. One of them, a man with a jaw set in permanent annoyance and eyes that scanned me with blatant disdain, stepped forward. "You," he barked, his hand resting instinctively near his belt. "Empty your pockets, now." I blinked, genuinely confused. I had nothing on me but my keys, my wallet, and my phone. "Excuse me?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, professional, and entirely calm. De-escalation was my specialty. It was how I'd made captain. "Don't play coy with me," the second officer sneered, moving to block my exit from the aisle. "We saw you slipping something into your jacket. We've been watching you on the cameras. Don't make this a scene, or we'll haul you in for a public disturbance on top of the theft." I felt a surge of cold fury, but I clamped it down. This was a classic power play, the kind that ruined lives, the kind I'd spent my career trying to dismantle from within. I held up my hands, palms open. "I haven't stolen anything. I suggest you check the surveillance footage properly, because I have been in this aisle for exactly 30 seconds. There is no theft, officer." The first one, the one with the sneer, took another step forward, his chest puffing out. "Are you talking back to me? You want to see how this ends? You look like you've got a history of this. Maybe you're connected to that local network we've been tracking, running errands for the group that's been moving those packages with the prohibited substances through this district. Maybe that's what's really in your bag, huh?" My blood went cold. He was setting the narrative. He was looking for an excuse to manufacture a case, to pin a felony on me just because he didn't like the look of me. I realized then that this wasn't about shoplifting. They weren't checking my bag. They were trying to intimidate me into a reaction so they could escalate. "I am asking you to lower your tone," I said, my voice dropping an octave, the authority I carried in the precinct bleeding into my tone. "I am not a suspect, and you are currently violating procedure. If you escalate this based on a lie, there will be a formal internal inquiry." The second officer let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "An internal inquiry? Listen to her. She thinks she knows how the system works. You want to see how the system actually works? You're coming with us. We've got reason to suspect you're hiding illegal weapons, and you're resisting arrest." He reached for his handcuffs, his grip firm and aggressive. I didn't fight back, but I didn't cower. As his fingers tightened around my wrist, I knew my silence had run its course. I reached slowly into my hoodie pocket, not for a weapon, but for the heavy, gold-toned piece of metal that defined my life. I pulled it out, the light catching the engraving, and held it up right before his eyes. "Before you put those cuffs on me," I said, my voice ice cold, "I suggest you take a very long look at what's in my hand, because the next 10 minutes are going to be the most expensive mistake of your entire career." The officer's eyes drifted to the badge, his face draining of color as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He froze, his partner's hand hovering midair, the silence in the aisle suddenly deafening. Then he looked up at me, his lip trembling, and he realized he hadn't just made a mistake. He had just handed me the evidence I needed to dismantle everything they stood for. He started to stammer, his arrogance collapsing, but I wasn't finished. I stepped closer, leaning into his space and whispered, "Now, tell me, Are you still so sure about that shoplifting charge? Or would you like to explain to the chief of police why you're harassing a captain? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The officer, whose name tag read Miller, stared at my badge as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. His partner, a younger man whose bravado evaporated the second he saw the gold, took a stumbling step backward, his hand dropping away from his duty belt as if the leather had turned to searing hot iron. "Captain," Miller finally choked out, his voice thin and cracking. The sneer was gone, replaced by the hollow, frantic look of a man who suddenly realized the floor beneath him had vanished. There must be a misunderstanding. The camera feed, it was grainy. We thought you were someone else. There's been a string of incidents." "Save it," I snapped, my voice echoing off the linoleum floor. I didn't holster my badge. I held it steady, letting the light catch the metallic finish, a constant reminder of the authority they had just tried to weaponize against me. "You didn't see a shoplifter, Miller. You saw a woman who you thought wouldn't fight back. You saw a target for a quick arrest to boost your stats, or maybe just to satisfy a bias that should have kept you out of this profession years ago." I watched his eyes dart toward the security camera in the corner. He was calculating. He was wondering if the footage had captured the audio, if the store manager had been watching, or if he could still scrub the interaction from the logs. That was his first mistake. He thought I was just a person being arrested. He didn't understand that I was an investigator, and I had been dissecting human patterns for 2 decades. "I'm not going to the precinct with you," I continued, closing the gap between us until I was looking him square in the eye. "Instead, you are going to call your sergeant. You are going to tell him exactly what happened here, and you are going to wait right here until the internal review unit arrives. You aren't going to touch your radio again, and you aren't going to talk to your partner." Miller's jaw tightened. The fear was warring with desperation. I saw the flash of something dark in his eyes, a flicker of realization that if this went to the higher-ups, his career wasn't just stalling, it was ending. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "You don't understand, Captain. This isn't just about us. You think you're so clean? You start pulling at this thread, you're going to unravel more than just my shift. There are people in this city, people with reach, who don't appreciate interference. You really want to stir up that nest?" My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a dirty cop trying to save his skin. This was a warning. He was implying that his conduct, the intimidation, the fabrication of evidence, the targeting, wasn't a solo act. It was part of a systemic rot, a group behavior that reached into the corners of the department I thought I knew like the back of my hand. "Is that a threat, Miller?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "It's a suggestion," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You're an outsider to some of the guys in the downtown sector. We handle things differently there. If you walk away now, we pretend this never happened. You keep your quiet life, and we keep doing our jobs. You push this, and you're going to find out that the badge you're holding is a lot smaller than the weight of what's actually moving through these streets." He stepped back, his posture shifting from defensive to something more predatory. I realized then that he wasn't afraid of the investigation anymore. He was confident in his protection. He signaled to his partner, and they both moved with a synchronized, practiced grace that made my skin crawl. They weren't just patrol officers. They were a part of something structured, something organized, and they were ready to defend it. Before I could reach for my radio to call for backup, the overhead lights in the entire aisle suddenly surged and then blew out, plunging us into near-total darkness. I heard the scuff of heavy boots on the floor, not from the officers, but from the back of the store, moving with tactical precision. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached for my service weapon at my hip, but before I could clear the holster, a cold, hard object pressed firmly against the base of my skull. It wasn't the barrel of a standard-issue weapon. It felt custom, heavy, and lethal. "Don't move, Captain," a voice hissed from the shadows behind me, a voice that sounded far too composed for someone committing a federal crime. "You wanted an investigation? You just found the heart of it. Now tell me, Do you really want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes? Or should we end your career right here in aisle 4? I didn't blink. I slowly turned my head, squinting into the gloom, only to see the red laser sight of the weapon dancing across my uniform. I realized with a sickening jolt that the store hadn't just gone dark by accident. This was a trap, and I had walked straight into the center of a much larger, much more dangerous game. The cold metal pressing against my skull didn't just threaten my life. It confirmed my worst fears. The darkness in the store wasn't a glitch. It was a tactical blackout. The store manager, the security guards, the very floor I stood on, everything had been compromised. My hand moved in slow motion, not toward my weapon, but toward the radio clip on my shoulder, hoping to trigger the silent panic button. "Don't," the voice behind me warned, a low, gravelly tone that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "We're listening on the frequency, Captain. Any attempt to reach out, and your next report will be filed from a hospital bed. Or, given the nature of the evidence you've been digging up, maybe you won't be filing one at all." Miller and his partner stood a few feet away, their faces illuminated only by the faint red glow of the laser sight. They weren't panicking anymore. They were waiting. They were parts of a machine, and I was the glitch they had been instructed to delete. "You're working for them," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling units. "The network that's been moving those packages through the South Side. Miller, you're throwing away your life for a group that won't even remember your name when the federal authorities finally move in." Miller spat on the floor. "The authorities? You mean the ones you report to? The ones who have been signing off on our extracurricular activities for months? You really have no idea how high the chain goes, do you?" My heart plummeted. I had spent months trying to track the source of the forbidden substances that had been flooding the city streets, always hitting a brick wall. I had blamed bad luck, administrative oversight, or just plain incompetence. I never dared to imagine that the wall was built of concrete, made of my own superiors. "You're lying," I said, though my confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. "Am I?" the man behind me countered. He shifted his grip, the weapon biting deeper into my skin. "We know about the case files you kept hidden at your house. The ones on the dock shipments. We know you thought you were being clever, keeping it off the precinct servers. But you were being watched from the moment you opened that first folder." A sudden realization struck me like a physical blow. The break-in at my home 2 weeks ago, the one the local precinct labeled as a random burglary, hadn't been for jewelry or electronics. They had been looking for the drive. They hadn't found it, which meant they were waiting for me to lead them to it. I had to move. I couldn't wait for them to decide my fate. I shifted my weight to my left foot, bracing my muscles for a sudden pivot. "You think you've caught me," I said, suddenly projecting my voice, hoping, praying, that the security camera in the adjacent aisle was still running on a backup battery. If I could get it on record, if I could make them speak, there might be a chance for justice, even if I wasn't the one to see it. "But you've already made your move. My partner, Sergeant Davis, he has the digital encrypted files. If I don't check in by midnight, the internal review unit receives an automated notification with everything you've been doing for the last 6 months." The pressure on my neck wavered for a split second. A look of genuine panic flickered across Miller's face. He turned toward the man behind me. "She's bluffing. She works alone. Everyone knows she's a lone wolf." "Is she?" the man replied, his voice chillingly calm. He reached into his coat with his free hand and pulled out a small, sleek device that looked like a signal jammer. He held it up, watching the status light blink. "We've been monitoring her communications. No outgoing signals have been sent to a private server in over 3 hours. She's isolated." He clicked the jammer off and the silence returned, sharper than before. "Now, Captain, let's go for a little ride. We're going to take a drive to your house and you're going to give us that drive yourself. If you cooperate, maybe you'll live long enough to see what happens when the city finally belongs to people who know how to manage it." He shoved me forward, forcing me to walk toward the back exit where a dark sedan sat idling, its headlights doused. I stumbled, my mind racing. I was unarmed, outnumbered, and surrounded by a network that had infiltrated the very core of my department. As I neared the exit, I saw the reflection in the glass door. a shadow moving rapidly behind them, someone else emerging from the dark aisles, a third player I hadn't accounted for. Just as the man behind me reached for the door handle, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the store. Not a gunshot, but the sound of something heavy crashing into a shelf of glass jars. They spun around, momentarily distracted, and in that heartbeat of chaos, I threw my weight back with everything I had, slamming my elbow into the ribs of the man holding the weapon. I scrambled into the aisle, my heart screaming for me to run. But as I turned the corner, I stopped dead. Standing there, holding a weapon of his own and staring at me with a look of pure, cold betrayal, was the one person I had trusted with my life, Sergeant Davis. He looked at the gun in my hand, then at the men behind me, and finally at me, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry, Captain," he said, his finger tightening on the trigger, "but you were never supposed to find out." The fluorescent lights flickered back to life, buzzing with an electric whine that sounded like a funeral dirge. The sudden glare blinded me, but the sight of Sergeant Davis, my right hand for 8 years, standing there with a weapon leveled at my chest, was enough to cut through any shock. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I looked from the cold, professional aim of the men behind me to the trembling, miserable expression on Davis's face. "Davis?" I breathed, the name tasting like ash. "Tell me you're undercover. Tell me you're playing the long game." He didn't lower the weapon. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a frantic, desperate edge to his breathing that I had never seen before. "I have a family, Captain. They took my kid. They didn't just threaten me. They showed me photos of him walking to school. They showed me exactly what would happen if I didn't feed them your movements." The air in the aisle felt heavy, charged with a tension that threatened to snap. Miller and the man with the jammer closed in, their faces twisted into sneers of triumph. They didn't even bother to hide their presence anymore. They knew that with Davis on their side, there were no witnesses left to tell the truth. "He's a good dog, isn't he?" The man with the jammer laughed, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. "He's been playing the role of the loyal partner for months. You really are a master of isolation, Captain. You keep everyone at a distance, and now that distance is going to be your grave." I looked at Davis. I saw the struggle behind his eyes, the crushing weight of a man who had sold his soul to keep his son safe. But in his hands, that weapon was a promise of my execution. I knew I couldn't rely on his conscience. I had to pivot to his fear. "Davis," I said, my voice low and steady, ignoring the barrel inches from my skin. "They're lying to you. Look at them. They aren't going to let your son go. Once I'm gone, you're the only person who knows their identities. You're a liability, not an asset. They aren't here to protect your family. They're here to tie up the final loose end." The man behind me scoffed. "Don't listen to her, Davis. She's a professional at manipulation. That's how she rose through the ranks, by tearing down anyone in her path. We've kept our end of the bargain. Your boy is safe. Just pull the trigger and we walk away." Davis wavered. The gun in his hand tilted just a fraction. It was the crack in the foundation I needed. I didn't wait for him to process the logic. I moved. I didn't lunge at Davis. I lunged for the shelves of household chemicals to my left. I grabbed a heavy container of industrial cleaning agent and hurled it with everything I had at the overhead sprinklers. The plastic casing shattered against the metal pipe, and a split second later, the system triggered. Cold, pressurized water erupted, turning the aisle into a chaotic, blinding storm. In the sudden deluge, visibility dropped to zero. I dove behind a display of cleaning supplies just as a shot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered a glass display behind me. I scrambled, sliding across the wet floor, my tactical training kicking in. I wasn't just a cop. I was the one who had written the department's response protocols for active shooter scenarios. I circled behind the checkout counter, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the roar of the water, I could hear their boots splashing on the tile. "Find her!" the leader shouted. "She's bleeding out there somewhere. Make sure she doesn't get to the exit." I didn't need the exit. I needed the manager's office. I knew the store had a secondary security terminal. a legacy system that wasn't connected to the main network, the one the department's internal audit used for store-wide inspections. If I could reach that terminal, I could trigger a high-priority distress signal that bypassed the local dispatcher and went straight to the independent oversight committee. I crawled through the narrow gap under the customer service desk, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I was inches from the heavy steel door of the manager's office when a hand grabbed my ankle and yanked me backward. I gasped, spinning around on my back, and found Miller staring down at me, his eyes wide with animal rage. He raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, the muzzle inches from my heart. I saw the flash of the hammer cocking, but just as he squeezed, the lights in the entire store shifted from harsh white to a pulsing, rhythmic crimson. A piercing, mechanical siren began to blare, not the fire alarm, but the emergency lockdown signal that activated only when the building's main vault was breached. Miller froze, his gaze flickering toward the front of the store. Through the cascading sheets of water, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The automatic doors didn't just slide open. They were blown off their hinges, and through the swirling mist of the sprinklers, a line of black-clad figures with heavy tactical gear began to move inside. They weren't police. They weren't from the precinct. They wore no badges, no insignias, just masks that turned their faces into blank, soulless mirrors. "It's not the Internal Review Unit," Miller whispered, his voice trembling as he dropped his weapon in terror. They aren't supposed to be here yet." The lead figure stopped in the center of the store, raised a weapon that was clearly not a service-issued sidearm, and turned its gaze directly toward me. The situation had just shifted from a local corruption case to a full-scale military-grade extraction, and I realized with a final, terrifying clarity that I was no longer the one being hunted. I was the prize they had both come to collect. The air in the store turned metallic, heavy with the scent of ozone and something far more dangerous. As the black-clad figures fanned out, their movements were so fluid, so devoid of hesitation, that they made Miller and his associates look like amateurs playing in a sandbox. These weren't cops. They were a private tactical unit, mercenaries of the very network Miller had been serving, dispatched to clean up the mess before the truth could ever reach a courtroom. Miller was trembling, his bravado replaced by the sheer existential dread of a man who realized he'd been nothing but a pawn. He looked toward the lead figure, his voice cracking. "Wait! We have the target! We had everything under control. Just give us more—" The lead figure didn't even acknowledge him. With a flick of a wrist, a suppressed weapon barked, a soft pneumatic sound. Miller collapsed without a scream, a look of profound shock frozen on his face. The man with the jammer didn't even try to reach for his weapon. He just turned and sprinted toward the loading docks, only to be cut down before he could reach the emergency exit. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand fumbling for my radio. It was dead, but I had one final card to play. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out the small, encrypted drive, the one I had been carrying all night, the one they had been so desperate to find. I didn't need to upload it to the precinct servers. I needed to upload it to the cloud-based mirror I'd set up on a secure, international server that was currently broadcasting an active distress signal to the Department of Justice's regional director. I looked at Davis. He was still standing in the aisle, his gun hanging limply at his side, watching the carnage with hollow eyes. He had realized finally that his son was never going to be returned. He had been a tool to be discarded. "Davis!" I shouted over the din of the sprinklers. "Throw the weapon, now!" He looked at me, a glimmer of clarity piercing through his despair. He realized that the only way to save whatever remained of his soul was to bear witness. He tossed the gun aside and stepped into the open, his hands raised. The black-clad figures turned toward him, their weapons swiveling with lethal precision. I didn't wait. I slammed my thumb onto the physical activation button on the drive. A red LED blinked once, twice, and then turned a steady, brilliant green. "The data is live," I shouted, my voice cutting through the store. "The moment you pull those triggers, an automated report with every bank account, every bribe, and every recorded conversation involving the syndicate will be pushed to every major news outlet and the federal prosecutor's office in the city. You want me? You have to kill me, but you'll be burying yourselves in the process." The lead figure stopped. He tilted his head, listening to a communication coming through his earpiece. The unit held its position, the red laser dots dancing across my chest and Davis's forehead. For a heartbeat, the fate of the entire city hung in that balance, the power of the machine versus the finality of the truth. Then, the lead figure lowered his weapon. He turned, signaling his team to retreat. They didn't run. They faded back into the darkness of the aisles, moving with an eerie, silent efficiency, disappearing into the night as if they had never existed. I stayed on the floor, my breath hitching in my chest, until the distant, growing chorus of sirens, the real ones, the sirens of a tactical response team I had managed to ping via the manager's terminal minutes earlier, began to wail through the streets. Minutes later, the store was flooded with federal agents and state investigators. The evidence I had collected, the digital trail, the testimony I'd forced out of Miller before he fell, and the sheer audacity of the hit on the store, was enough to shatter the foundation of the precinct's shadow network. The fallout was historic. Within 48 hours, the chief of police was in handcuffs, and the organized scheme that had terrorized the streets was being dismantled from the top down. Davis survived, though he resigned in shame, turning himself in as a state witness. His cooperation helped secure the conviction of the men behind the curtain, and while he would never wear a uniform again, his testimony saved a city from being swallowed by its own darkness. I kept my badge, not because of the pride I once felt, but because of the lesson I'd learned in Aisle 4. The badge wasn't a symbol of authority, it was a target, and that was exactly why I would never take it off. Weeks later, I stood in the parking lot of the Megamart, watching the crews clear away the remnants of the shootout. The store was closed indefinitely, but the neighborhood was already beginning to breathe again. A young officer, someone I didn't recognize, approached me. He looked at my uniform, then at the scarred metal badge on my chest. He didn't look at me with arrogance or disdain. He looked at me with respect. "Heading back on duty, Captain?" he asked. I touched the cold gold metal. I thought of the long road ahead, the enemies I had made, and the system that still needed to be purged. I smiled, a small, tired but genuine expression. "I never really left," I said. And as I turned toward the precinct, I knew that the real fight was only just beginning. But for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't fighting it alone. I was fighting for a truth that couldn't be silenced. And this time, the world was finally watching.